After the war, the general who commanded Adolf Hitler's last offensive in the West was asked plainly why it failed. He didn't blame the tanks that ran out of fuel. He didn't blame the infantry stretched too thin across too wide a front. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt blamed the sky. It is a strange thing for a general to say. Weather is not an enemy that outmaneuvers you. It does not outfight you. And yet Rundstedt, a man who had commanded German forces since the invasion of Poland, who had broken through the same Ardennes forest 4 years earlier in one of the most celebrated campaigns in modern military history, who by December of 1944 had spent longer in senior field command than almost any general on either side of the war, looked back on the greatest gamble of his career and pointed, without hesitation, at the clouds. To understand what he meant, you have to understand what those clouds were actually hiding. For the first 6 days of his offensive, the sky belonged entirely to him. Fog and low clouds sat over the Ardennes so thick that the most powerful air force ever assembled, the combined weight of American and British air power in Western Europe, simply could not fly. Reconnaissance planes stayed grounded. Fighter bombers stayed grounded. For 6 days, Rundstedt's panzer divisions moved through Belgium and Luxembourg exactly as if that air force did not exist at all, because for all practical purposes, it didn't. This was not luck. German planners had built the entire offensive around it. Hitler had personally insisted the attack launch during a stretch of poor winter weather specifically because the one advantage the Allies held that Germany could not match by December of 1944 was air power. Every other resource, fuel, trained infantry, functioning armor, was already stretched thin and getting thinner. The one variable Hitler could still control was timing, and he chose to gamble the entire operation on a forecast. Take the sky away, even temporarily, and a badly outnumbered, poorly fueled German force suddenly had a fighting chance to reach the Meuse River before anyone could organize a response. On the 16th of December, under exactly the fog Hitler had gambled on, a barrage of some 1,600 artillery pieces opened the offensive along an 85-mile front, and the force behind it struck an American line stretched thin and manned in places by inexperienced replacements who had never seen combat. It worked at first, better than almost anyone on the Allied side expected. Within days, American positions at Saint-Vith were nearly surrounded. Bastogne, a crossroads town controlling 7 roads through the Ardennes, was cut off entirely. Its garrison of roughly 18,000 men suddenly fighting encircled with no clear way to be resupplied by road. The desperation on the other side of the fog is its own kind of evidence for how much that weather actually mattered. On December 21st, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Western Europe, wrote in his diary that this was the shortest day of the year, and that he prayed it might, by some miracle, mark the beginning of improved weather. This was not a private soldier's superstition. This was the man running the entire Western war, reduced to hoping for a break in the clouds. General George Patton, whose Third Army was racing to relieve Bastogne, went further than hoping. He ordered his chief chaplain to write a formal prayer for clear weather and had it distributed to his troops. An American army was, quite literally, praying for the fog to lift. Inside Bastogne itself, the siege was becoming a matter of simple arithmetic. Ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Wounded men were being treated with what little morphine remained in makeshift aid stations that couldn't be resupplied because nothing could safely fly in or out. Doctors were reportedly forced to reuse bandages and ration anesthetic for men undergoing field surgery, decisions no medical officer wants to be making in the middle of a siege. The town held, But the math on how much longer it could keep holding was getting worse by the hour. And everyone from Eisenhower down to the lowest private in the perimeter understood that the math was tied directly to the weather report. On December 23rd, the weather broke. Meteorologists called the system responsible a Russian high, a Behizme mass of clear, cold air pushing in from the east that shoved the fog out and left the sky over the Ardennes a hard, translucent blue for the first time in a week. Temperatures dropped even further as the clouds cleared, turning the battlefield into a brutal, frozen landscape at the exact moment it also became visible from above for the first time since the offensive began. Within 30 minutes of dawn, American fighter bombers were airborne and over the battlefield. Ground crews who had spent 6 days maintaining aircraft that couldn't fly suddenly had every plane on the line fueled, armed, and moving. What happened next reversed the entire shape of the battle in a matter of days. Over the following 5 days of clear weather, Allied air forces flew more than 34,000 combined sorties and dropped close to 35,000 tons of bombs on the battle area. Roughly 2/3 of that weight aimed specifically at the railways, roads, and bridges German columns depended on to keep moving supplies and reinforcements forward. Numbers on that scale are hard to picture, so picture it this way instead. For 6 days, a single German convoy could drive an open road in daylight without a second thought. Starting on the 23rd, that same convoy might not survive the trip. Individual engagements from those days show what those numbers looked like on the ground. The 354th Fighter Group caught elements of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's most capable armored formations, and sent its tanks scrambling for cover near the town of Fourrières. The 356th hit 10 tanks and 20 trucks in a single engagement near the same area. The 84th Infantry Division, nearly surrounded and fighting for its survival, had P-47s from the 354th diving on the armor closing in around it within the same stretch of days. None of these were isolated lucky strikes. They were what became possible over and over, once the fog that had protected German movement for a week finally lifted. German ground troops had a nickname for the American fighter bombers that did most of this work: the P-47s, P-51s, and P-38s that appeared overhead almost the moment the clouds thinned. They called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber, and the name carried real fear behind it rather than mockery. Columns that had been moving freely for a week now had to scatter for cover at the sound of an engine, because staying on an open road in daylight had become close to a death sentence. German commanders would later acknowledge they simply did not have a supply and replacement system capable of matching the pace at which American aircraft, fuel, and pilots kept arriving from factories and training fields an ocean away. A logistics gap the Luftwaffe had no real answer for, even before Bodenplatte made it worse. One of the pilots flying those missions, a P-47 pilot with the 9th Air Force's 48th Fighter Group, had spent the previous months learning exactly the kind of close air support work the Ardennes now demanded, dive bombing and strafing runs practiced over and over before he ever saw combat. By his own account, decades later, the relief of finally being able to fly again after days grounded by weather was almost physical. Missions that had been theoretical for a week became real within minutes of takeoff, hunting the same roads and columns the fog had kept safe for far too long. The same clearing sky that let American aircraft hunt German columns also let cargo planes finally reach Bastogne. C-47 transports, guided in by Pathfinder crews who parachuted ahead of them to mark the drop zone, began dropping ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the surrounded defenders that same day the weather broke. One officer inside the perimeter later said the town itself seemed to vibrate with the thunder of American engines. Civilians sheltering underground reportedly cried and embraced each other at the sound of it. None of this ran itself. Behind every sortie was ordinary, freezing, unglamorous work. Private Henry Mark Connell, an armorer with the 406th Fighter Group, spent those days lashing fragmentation bombs and canisters of napalm onto the wings of P-47s out on runways slick with slush and wind, working in conditions rough enough that the wooden huts his unit lived in were heated by coal stoves nobody could reliably light. Someone in his unit discovered, almost by accident, that a small amount of napalm dropped into a stove's ash pan was the fastest way to get a fire going. It became a standard trick, a strange, dark little piece of practical knowledge born directly out of the same substance being loaded onto aircraft a few hundred yards away, to be used on German troops. At dawn on the 23rd, the aircraft Connell and men like him had spent the fog-bound week arming and rearming finally left the ground. And within half an hour, they were over the battlefield. None of this should be mistaken for a Luftwaffe that simply gave up or sat back. Germany's Air Command understood exactly what the clearing sky meant. And on New Year's Day, 1945, they answered with the largest single air operation the Luftwaffe had mounted in years. Operation Bodenplatte sent hundreds of German fighters in a coordinated, low-level surprise attack against Allied airfields across the front, timed specifically to catch aircraft parked and vulnerable on the ground rather than fight them in the air, where American numbers and pilot experience now held every advantage. The planning had been kept secret enough that some German pilots didn't learn their exact targets until hours before takeoff. And the low-altitude approach was designed deliberately to slip beneath Allied radar coverage. It was not a reckless plan. It was, on paper, one of the more carefully coordinated strikes German air power attempted in the entire war. And it did real damage, destroying and disabling a meaningful number of Allied aircraft caught on the ground in the opening minutes. In some cases, catching entire squadrons before their pilots had even reached the flight line. It still failed, and it failed in a way that mattered far more than the aircraft lost that morning. The secrecy that made the operation possible also undid parts of it. Many German anti-aircraft crews along the route were never briefed that Luftwaffe formations would be flying low and in force that morning. And at least some German aircraft were fired on by their own side in the confusion. One Pathfinder pilot, Sergeant Erich Heider, had to take evasive action against exactly this, and was heard exclaiming in disbelief that it was German flak firing on him. Historians still disagree on just how much of the day's losses that confusion actually accounts for, with more recent detailed research suggesting the popular claim that a third of German losses came from friendly fire is likely overstated. But the confusion itself, planned in secrecy so tight that even the men defending the airfields below didn't know what was coming, was real. German losses in trained pilots during Bodenplatte were effectively irreplaceable at that stage of the war, regardless of exactly how each aircraft was lost. Germany could still, with enormous strain on its industry, build more aircraft. It could no longer train enough pilots to fly them competently, and the veteran pilots lost on New Year's Day were exactly the men the Luftwaffe could least afford to lose. Allied air dominance over the battlefield reasserted itself almost immediately afterward. And this time, it did not meaningfully waver again for the rest of the war in the West. Germany's last major effort to answer the sky ended up costing it the ability to contest that sky at all. The battle ground on for weeks after the skies cleared, through brutal winter fighting and a German retreat fought yard by yard back toward the border. Bastogne itself was finally relieved on December 26th, when a spearhead of Sherman tanks from Patton's Third Army broke through the German ring around the town and made physical contact with the exhausted defenders inside 3 days after the weather had first turned in the Allies' favor. The siege had lasted a week. It had been broken almost entirely because the sky had opened up long enough for both the fighter bombers savaging the German perimeter from above and the relief column fighting its way up from the south to finally do the jobs they had been unable to do while grounded and stalled respectively. But the 6 days of fog, followed by the reversal that came with clear weather, sat at the center of how the entire offensive was understood by the men who fought it, on both sides. Rundstedt's own post-war assessment was blunt and specific. His forces had lacked the fighters and reconnaissance aircraft to match what the Allies could put in the air. And once the weather stopped shielding him from that gap, the outcome was no longer seriously in doubt. General Omar Bradley, who commanded American ground forces through the battle, put the same conclusion in broader terms afterward, writing that from the German high command down to the ordinary soldier in the field, German opinion was united on one point. Allied air power was the single most striking aspect of Allied superiority in the entire campaign. That is not one general's private theory. It is Bradley's own summary of what he understood the consensus to be across the entire German military he had just spent months fighting. From the field marshal planning the offensive to the private manning a foxhole under a Jabos engine, Rundstedt never faced trial for his role in the war. Captured by American forces in May of 1945, he suffered a heart attack during his own interrogation, was held in Britain for several years, and was released in 1948 without ever standing before a tribunal. It was during that captivity that British and American military historians, including Basil Liddell Hart, sat down with him repeatedly to reconstruct his own account of the war's major campaigns. And it is largely from those post-war interviews that his blunt assessment of the Ardennes offensive comes down to us. He died in Hanover in February of 1953. Having spent nearly half a century in uniform, from the Imperial German Army of the First World War through the final collapse of the Wehrmacht he had helped lead. Rundstedt had broken through the Ardennes once before, in 1940, under a clear sky with no enemy air force capable of stopping him. And it had made him one of the most celebrated commanders in German military history. 4 years later, in the same forest, with the same tactical instincts and much of the same daring, he tried it again and very nearly succeeded, for exactly as long as the fog was willing to cooperate. When Eisenhower's prayer and Patton's chaplain's prayer were both answered on the same December morning. The war's most experienced Ardennes commander did not need anyone to explain to him what had just changed. He had built his entire offensive around denying the Allies their sky for as long as possible, because he understood, better than almost anyone else in that war, exactly what it would cost him the moment he got it back.